This is Michael Smoot for YouTube Commentaries. Today is November 7th. It's a Monday. We're in the year 2016. The topic of today's conversation is, you can't go home. However, sometimes you can. Today we're going to be talking about, first we're going to define what these two sentences mean, the title of this conversation. Then I'm going to take you on a journey of discovery where we go back to where I grew up in Nassau County in an unincorporated hamlet of 20,000 called Wantagh, and then we'll go on a journey and we'll go through the first 26 years of my life and what I learned during the process. And then we'll have some concluding thoughts, and before we do that, we're going to do a pre-introduction. And in the pre-introduction, I'm going to speak to you about what are the reasons for this conversation, what triggered it, and what led me on this path where I feel compelled to have this conversation with you. And with that said, let's start with the pre-introduction. First of all, about 6 months ago, I wrote an essay about 12,000 words or more, and it's called "I'm a Product of the Environment I Was Raised In." And the reason I decided to do that essay stems from the fact on January 31st, 2016, I suffered through a near-death experience. I collapsed at work. I could have died. Fortunately, they brought me across the street, and I survived. And then 3 or 4 months later, I had open heart surgery. And so what did I learn? I learned lots of things. I learned that why I am the way I am, and in terms of what my philosophy is, and how that's guided me through life. In terms of why I am the way I am, there are lots of reasons. But for starters, a central reason is I'm a product of the environment I was raised in. I was raised in the home with my parents, 3 siblings. And from my parents, I'm aware, and I certainly understand that how I look at how I handle money in terms of paying off debts and saving money, what I think about spirituality and religion, how I think about parenting and politics and marriage. So those 5 areas right there serve as a template for guiding me through life. And in terms of how I choose to interpret it, there are many things I have in common with my siblings, and then there are some ways we differ, but we still have a lot in common in that respect. In terms of what my overriding philosophy is, well, in previous YouTube conversations, I outlined for you 5 daily affirmations that I speak about every day, and it helps me keep honest with myself, whereby I'm able to stay on track and be in touch with my emotional intelligence. And what I've done recently is I, in a sense, condensed all 5 of these affirmations together and come up with one. Sometimes it takes me 2 sentences to say it, but here it goes. Let me give it a try now. What I'm saying is, it's far less important that in any communication with anyone that they think I'm smart, funny, or if we have a disagreement, that I'm right. It's far more important that in any conversation that people know that they're being listened to and they walk away feeling respected. So those are some important things that I've figured out since I had this near-death experience. Now, since we've gone through a pre-introduction, let's start with the introduction. You can't go home again. However, maybe you can. This is after the trip to process of rediscovery, going back to where I grew up the first 26 years of my life. I said that to myself, you can't go home again. And then I thought, well, I didn't make that up. Who did? And I looked it up, and it actually was a line based upon a novel, a title of a novel, written by a fellow by the name of Thomas Wolfe. It was published posthumously in 1940. And what it's about is, if you look upon the most important moments of your life, the most meaningful, the most joyful, if you try to manufacture a situation where you come away with the same sort of feelings and walk away from it, frequently you're going to fall short. So that's why you're going to see things have changed, where you just can't get that feeling, you can't get that moment, even if you try to do the same things, and sometimes even if you get the same people together. So it's a bit of a challenge. But what I'm saying is, that's right. A lot of times you just can't manufacture those thoughts and feelings and recreate the magic that you once experienced, but then again, sometimes you can. So now that I've said that, let me take you on a journey from where I live to where I grew up and why I did that. It all started about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, and it was on a Sunday, and it was raining out, and that's the year 2014. And I didn't have too much to do. There were some things I needed to do, but I just wanted to go for a ride. And I spoke to my wife, and she said to me, well, I've got work to do. So I said, well, I want to do this. And she said, go ahead. So I hopped in the car. We live in Forest Hills, Queens. That's an outer borough of New York City, of course. And I wanted to drive to where I grew up. Some people call it Long Island. It's in Nassau County, and it's an unincorporated village just north of Jones Beach State Park and Nikon Theater. It took me 40 to 60 minutes to get there. And I wanted to drive out there and stop at 6 or 7 places and just try to get that old feeling back to what I previously had, and experience some of those old feelings again. And the thoughts and feelings that I came away with were surprising. And anyway, let me tell you what happened. So it took me 40 to 60 minutes to get there. And when I got there, the first place I got to was the place where I grew up. And I pulled up in front of the house. And when I parked, I finally figured out what I really wanted to do. Before I turned my head 90 degrees to the left, I said to myself, I want to look in the backyard and see if they raked the leaves. This is a backyard that I probably raked the leaves dozens, maybe hundreds of times in my first 20 years or more growing up in this home. And when I turned my head over, what surprised me was the in front of the house on the side was a white fence. It could have been wood, fiberglass, or metal, but it was anywhere from 5 to 6 feet tall. And then the whole idea of finding out what was in that backyard, whether they raked the leaves or not, that became really important. And I was ready to, I was parked across the street. I was ready to get out of the car, cross the street, walk over the sidewalk, and actually step down on the grass of someone's private property. This is a home I grew up in. I lived for most of the first 26 years of my life, but it belonged to somebody else now. And then something hit me in my head that I can only explain to you as being a Seinfeld moment. And I just imagined that I got out of the car, and as I got out of the car, the people in the home, they finished their breakfast: eggs, bagels, juice, coffee. And in my imagination, they looked out the window and they saw a stranger. These people didn't know me, and they didn't know that I previously lived there. They saw me walking up to this fence, jumping up and down, trying to figure if the leaves were raked, and they wouldn't know that. So in a moment of clarity, I said to myself, well, if there's even a remote chance of that happening, it would ruin my trip and it wouldn't be any fun. And and who the heck wants to get the bad end of a Seinfeld episode? So basically, I talked myself out of getting out of the car, and I decided not to look in the backyard. And before I left, there were a number of things I observed, but time permits us from only reviewing one. One of the things that I couldn't help but noticing is that the trees were awful large, awful tall. But these were seedlings when they were planted in 1979, 80, 81. And here I am coming back for a visit. It's 2014. So it didn't take long for me to figure out, between soil and sun and rain and the growing seasons, that these trees got really tall from seedlings. And in a few years, they were going to be covering the entire street. So finally, observing the obvious, I felt a little better. So I drove the car to my elementary school. And it took about 5 minutes weaving through the neighborhood, driving carefully, getting to the elementary school. And I arrived in front of my elementary school. It's called the Wantagh Elementary School. And it's on Beech Street. That's Beech. And maybe I got confused over the spelling as a 5 or 6 year old in kindergarten, or maybe it was the pronunciation. I think maybe when I was 5 or 6, I'd call it the Beech Street School. That was what it was informally called. Anyway, I pull up in front of the school, and I look out expecting to see the basketball court, and there was no basketball court. It was no longer macadam, which had some give and take to it. It was concrete with yellow lines, and I didn't see anywhere to play basketball. There were no cars parked. It was a Sunday because it was a day off, but it was empty. And there was a ramp to get in and out of the parking lot. So the first thing that came to my mind was the line from the Joni Mitchell song. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. And that kind of makes sense to me. I used to play there frequently, except during summers, every Saturday. From September of 1965 to, let's say, June of 1967. I was between the ages of 10 and 12. These were revolutionary times. We had the Vietnam War in protests. We had civil rights marches. Things didn't really heat up till the following year, 1968. So it was quieter, but it still there still was a time of revolutionary change. So, but to me, I was a 10 or 12-year-old kid. I wasn't so focused on the news, and to me, I just felt and lived a relatively stress-free life. I'd get up in the morning on a Saturday. In those days, in 5th and 6th grade, they didn't really give kids homework from elementary school. So in sunup, I would eat my breakfast, and I'd go out. And a lot of times, of course, we didn't have cell phones and computers and internet or cable TV. What would happen is I simply would just get out, and I'd walk a half a mile to this playground. Sometimes I didn't have to go over anybody's house. We would just know to meet there. I would meet people, and I would meet people I would see on a regular basis, and I'd meet new people. And we'd play basketball all day long. I don't even remember going home for lunch in those times. And I do remember when we weren't playing basketball on what's now a parking lot, and it was a basketball court back then, playing all day long. Who knows, maybe I went all day without a tuna fish sandwich. And in the fall, October and November, we would play touch football. So that Joni Mitchell song, the line from it makes a lot of sense, because the thing about it is that was my idea of paradise. I'd get together with my friends. I had no worries in the world, and I'd play basketball all day long. So that was real fun, and I have some great childhood memories of that place. So this is a suburban community of 20,000 people. Some people I know who I went to school with, who went to that school, probably live in the community, but they pass that place, they live there every day. They don't look at it the same way. And certainly anybody younger than me probably doesn't remember there was ever a basketball court there. So to me it seemed terribly important, but to a lot of people living in this little village or hamlet, it really is not anything they think about. But for me, even though I would visit my parents when they owned the home from time to time, it's not anything that I really thought about, but it seemed very important in this trip back in November 2014. So once that all sunk in, I took the next trip, the next stop on my the third leg on my rediscovery of my youth and early adulthood. So the next thing I did is I drove to there's a compound with a junior high, and next to it is the high school I went to. And I had to weave a bit, but I finally made my way as far back. There were some locked fences, but I was able to park the car, and it stopped, and I got out and walked out, and I walked within 15 feet of one particular room. And that room was where I took 10th grade geometry. And it's a funny thing. I was a B+ student, but that course was perhaps, it wasn't my favorite course. I didn't really like it, and I wasn't very good at it. But taking that course, it was perhaps the most important course that I took through my 3 years of high school. In those days, high school was sophomore, junior, and senior year. Your freshman year, you were actually in the junior high. Now things are a little different between middle school and high school. Now it's back then it was junior high and high school. Anyway, I walk up to about 15 feet of the window, and that's the window I had 10th grade geometry. There were some 11th graders in my class, but the thing is, we were all suffering through that class. Through the first 3 quarters, it was very interesting. I had a C+ average. And I had absolutely no idea how I even got a 75, because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. Geometry was a mystery to me. It was far harder than algebra for me, or any other kind of elementary math. And I knew one thing for certain as I entered the 4th quarter. I knew that I was going to have a Regents exam, which is a super hard state math exam. And the one thing that was certain was I knew at that point, no matter what grade I was getting in the 4th quarter, unless I'd made a change, I was going to flunk that exam. And I spoke because I just didn't know the work. And it wasn't that I wasn't trying, I was trying very hard. And I know the rest of the class was struggling too, and I could have said, well, misery loves company, let's just coast through. I pass or I don't pass. Whether it may or may not have affected my getting a Regents diploma. That was a special sticker on your diploma, which may or may not have been important back then. But anyway, I remember I made, at 15 or 16 years old, was maybe just before my 16th birthday. Anyway, the point is, I made an adult-like decision. I went to my parents and I said, I need a tutor. And I don't know if I saw the tutor over how many months or how frequently, but I do know one thing. I do remember one thing. I remember on that Regents exam, I got a 66. One answer wrong, I might have gotten a 65 or a 64. 64 is flunking, a 66 is a D. And the funny thing is, as a reward for getting a D on the Regents exam, which helped guarantee that I get a Regents diploma from the high school, as a reward, they dropped my yearly grade from a C+ to a C. And yet that grade is really important because it represents something that was going to happen to me throughout my life, in school, in the world of work, in my personal life with my family. You're going to have situations where you're not going to win, or you don't think you're going to win, and you have to somehow grind it out, tough it out, persevere, and I learned a valuable lesson from that course. So getting a C in 10th grade geometry is far more important to than the 88 average that I that I received throughout 3 years of high school. And the funny thing is, I never walked up to the room. I'm sure if I walked up to the room, I would have seen that there were workstations, iPads, laptops. In those days, we didn't have those kind of computer equipment. So I'm thinking that in this situation, in this one particular situation, this is the third stop. The first two, it physically had changed the place I was visiting. In this place, the high school basically looked the same, but inside the classroom, it may have looked different. But the fact that I simply was within 15 feet of the window, and the important memories that are really important, something meaningful that I got out of this experience was very clear to me. And I didn't stay long, but it was, and I didn't even think much about it before I went by the high school, but I did walk away, and I understood why this room was very important to my life now, right now, 40 some odd years later. So what I did is I hopped in the car, and I drove for 25 minutes. And I drove to the office my father worked at. And it was a special place. It's a kind of place that doesn't happen anymore. And I'll tell you why. My grandfather had a number of businesses. And he had come from Europe as an infant. Or maybe he was born here. I'm not 100% sure. Basically, he came over with my great-grandparents. And he worked in that office, and he worked there until I was nearly 13, and then he passed away. And he ran his businesses, and in that same office, my father was an attorney. He practices law, and I had two uncles who also worked in that office, and they sold insurance, and it was in what you might call a strip mall, and you took a look at it. It's not exactly, you're looking at some 60 skyscraper, feet tall or hundreds of feet tall building, some huge tower. It was a one-story building in a rather unremarkable suburban community, but it was a special place. So the thing about that particular day was, I looked up at the sign, and it was a sports bar. And then I looked, the next thing I saw at the window, and it said maximum seating. And then I looked inside, and it was about 10:30 on a Sunday morning. Now, in November of the year, this is 2 years ago, but every November, it's pro football season. So the place looked dark and dingy. And the thing about it is, in fairness, looking back upon this moment later, probably by 12 o'clock when everybody comes into this place, the house lights are on, the flat screens are lit up. Maybe before the game, what they're doing is people are eating buffalo wings and burgers. Maybe they have piped in music. Lots of guys coming there, maybe with their girlfriends, and maybe it's a warm and nice place. So maybe I was overly harsh saying, well, it's dingy and it's a dump. But my recollection, my memories of this place is, this was a really important place. All of my heroes worked there. My grandfather, my father, my uncles. When I'd walk in, I'd always get a big hug first from my uncle's office help. And I remember visiting a lot after my grandfather passed, and then my father was in the back, and he'd have his glasses on, he'd have a law book in his hand, and he'd be smoking a pipe, and he looked professorial. And the one thing that it didn't occur to me till I walked up to this place, this memory that came back that I hadn't thought about in 25 years since they closed up shop at this office. What I remember was the pipe smoke. It had a sweet smell, and it was lovely. And today you simply call it in political correctness, and that's not a bad thing. but they call it secondhand smoke. Now today, now when I think about it, it was a lovely aroma. So actually, at the time, I was disappointed visiting that place because the only thing it had in common with my father's office was the address. It didn't look at all like the office. The furniture was long gone. The people who used to work there had long passed away. But the thing that I'm really glad is that I didn't go in there because I wouldn't have smelled the tobacco smoke. And what's the use of walking into the bar if I can't smell the tobacco smoke my father used when smoking his pipe? So, and it wasn't until I left this place and came home. Initially, I said, well, you can't go home again. But once I was far away from this place in the quiet of my home, I did think about, and I say, well, I remembered the smell, and I remembered the feelings, and I remembered how important these people were into my life. And so, it wasn't at first that I realized how important it was. And frankly, it isn't important that I visit there ever again. I could just sit in the quiet of my own home or anywhere, and I could bring up these memories of getting together with these people who are so important in my life. So I don't physically have to go to that place because it's very crisp and clear, those feelings, and they're very strong, those feelings. So the next thing I did is, that would be the fourth stop on my journey. The fifth stop, well, all I had to do was turn around. I was looking for the diner that, you see, my father and his brothers had a habit. Every day, sometimes from mid-morning, they'd go out for a coffee break. And then, I don't remember specific the time, but they'd go out for a sandwich or something else for a bite to eat. They'd go to a diner. The diner was called Irving's. Being Jewish, and my parents would speak a little Hebrew, they would pronounce it not Irving's, they would call it Oiving's. And I looked across the street for Irving's. It used to be a strip mall across the street. Well, the thing about it is that strip mall was completely gone, and it was a huge parking lot. And at the end of the parking lot was a super Stop and Shop or Waldbaum's. So it was a gigantic supermarket. So any forensic evidence of what might have existed there, what closed up 20 or 25 years ago, it no longer existed. But what existed was, I do remember very clearly, I remember going to lunch with my father and my uncles, meeting Irving. Irving was the owner and manager of the business. And he also wore another hat. He was a server. And we'd walk in there, and he'd greet my father and brothers, and he'd have a smile on his face. And like me, he was follically challenged. He didn't have so much hair on the top of his head. And, he'd greet us, and he would be smiling and joking with my father and my uncles. And they'd be sitting down and ordering. They knew the menu by heart. And there would be all sorts of conversation and laughter, and it was like an inside joke. And I didn't even understand the joke, but I just felt the levity and the good feelings between them. And one of my uncles would order food, and it was like he was speaking in shorthand. And he'd use certain hand motions, and I didn't know what was going on. And I never thought asking about what was going on. What's the inside joke? Let me in on the joke. And I don't know if I even asked myself, what's this about? All I know is there's something going on here, and I'm part of it, and I'm out with these three cool guys, my dad and my two uncles, and they're having a good time with the owner, manager, and server. And it was a special place. So the fact is that this place doesn't exist anymore. There's nothing left. But the fact is, those memories are very important, and they're very clear and crisp, and I felt welcomed, and I had fun, and those memories are always going to be with me. You can't manufacture those memories, but they're very important. And so the fifth stop was merely turning around 180 degrees and looking across the street and not seeing anything there. And like what was behind me, this shopping mall, with the supermarket, was now what exists physically, but it was the memories of what existed back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is very clear to me. So at the time I was disappointed, but later on I realized how important the whole thing was. Now, next thing I did is I drove another 20, 25, 30 minutes, and I was on the North Shore, and I went to, when I went to college, it was called C.W. Post College, and I was a government major there. And there are a lot of stories I could tell about visiting that day and about college, but time permits us from going into too much detail. So what I did was, the first thing I did is I walked up to what's called Humanities Hall, and that's where my political science professor and other social science professors and the academic advisors would meet. So we'd go there for one-on-one time with our professors or advice with our academic advisor. So I walked up to this building, and it's still overcast and rainy. It's a beautiful campus. It's a bucolic setting with Tudor-style buildings. And so the thing is, the place was locked. And of course I was disappointed. I wanted to walk around, but it wasn't until that I got home that I realized it wasn't important that it was locked. I received my bachelor's degree in May or June of 1977. And my favorite professor who worked in that building until the time he passed away, which is 2002 or 3, he worked in that building. And it was kind of an unusual relationship. His door was always open to me. I can't say I visited him every year, once a year, but I visited him a lot, and I would make an appointment to meet with him after I graduated, and we'd talk about my career, how I wanted to have a career in government. We'd talk about the fact that I may want one day to teach, that I might want to go for an additional degree, and about how the field had changed. So this is a man. I visited this institution in 2014, and he passed away 11 or 12 years before. So the thing about it is, it wasn't at the time. It was a disappointment. I couldn't get in there, but it wasn't until that I left, that I went home, that I realized it wasn't important. What was important were the memories, and it was even more important than college. It was more important that for nearly a quarter of a century after college we kept up a relationship, and he was a mentor of sorts to me. And after I'd meet with him in his office, frequently once a year, he'd take me out to lunch, and those restaurants still exist. Sometimes he'd bring a colleague along, and we always had good conversations. And some of my friends